I recently went on a prayer walk, and before I left my house, I felt God kind of nudging me to bring my camera. Now, I usually don't bring my camera whenever I go out to pray because there's not really anything for me to record, and I just like to have that alone time with God. But while I was changing and getting ready to leave, I just kind of felt the Spirit nudging me to bring my camera, just getting this sense that there's something that He wanted me to record. And so I brought my camera, I left my house, and immediately one thing that caught my eye was the nature surrounding me. We're currently in a season of fall, and I think it's safe to say that fall is a really big season of change. And the effects of this change are so evident around us, especially we can see in nature. There were a lot of trees that were halfway changing colors. Some were half green, half yellow. There's some trees that were just starting to change color. There were others that were almost completely covered in that new color. And there were other trees that were completely withered away and there's no leaves to be found already. And this immediately stood out to me, so I decided to record a video, get some footage, get some B-roll, and just record the changes that were happening around me. I kept on walking, and eventually I stumbled across this pond that I often go to in my neighborhood when I go out for prayer walks. And one thing that immediately caught my eye from this pond was the fact that the waters were completely still. Now, usually whenever I go and pray and I pass by this pond, there's always some sort of ripple in the waters. This is due to the fact that there are some otters that are swimming in the waters. There's also a fountain right in the middle, so a lot of the water is being pumped out. And so I'm always used to seeing some sort of movement and rippling in the waters every time I pass by this pond. But for some reason, on this prayer walk, the waters were completely still. And it had me thinking about there's so many change happening around this pond. As you can see, there's so many trees surrounding this pond. There's so much plants. There's so much life, so much greenery that surrounds this pond. And there's so much change happening to these plants, to the grass, to the trees, to the little plants and the flowers. There's so much change happening to them. Some are changing color, some are starting to wither. And there's just so much effects of the changing season. And it's become so evident amongst all of these plants, all of the greenery that surrounds this pond. But in the midst of all of that change, and in the midst of its evidence, the pond remained still. There was change surrounding the pond. The leaves and the trees and the colors were changing, and a lot of the leaves were falling away. And there's so much evident change from the weather happening around this pond, but the pond in and of itself was still. And it just kind of gave me this thought of how a lot of these trees and a lot of these plants and a lot of the greenery are dependent on this pond for life. This pond brings water, and we all know that a lot of plants need water in order to thrive and to live and to survive. And so a lot of these plants, you can say the trees, the grass, they depend on this pond for life. They depend on its water to survive. They need its nutrients. And in the midst of all of the change happening around, this pond remained still. And what a perfect metaphor to use for this walk of faith we live in, this life following Christ, where we're people that are subject to change, and it becomes evident in our lives. We too are like these trees surrounding the pond that in seasons times, when they change, we change colors. Whether we're growing as people and our personalities change, whether our life situation changes or our living situation changes, or our friendships change, we are prone to change, and it becomes evident from the colors that we show, just like these trees when fall time comes around. But in the midst of all of these change, we serve a God that remains still and the same. We too are like the changing plants and the changing trees and the changing grass surrounding this pond, in need of life from one thing that remains still and constant, and that is God, the God of the pond. This imagery showed me that it's very much possible to live this life with a true anchor, and to live this life truly with a person that remains the same, and that person is Jesus. Just like the plants and the trees and the grass are dependent on the pond for life throughout every season, I too am in need and dependent on God for purpose, for a reason of living, for meaning on this life, a reason to wake up every day and do everything that I do, because of his stillness. The same person that God found in me when I first got saved at 15 years old has changed. It's become evident. You can see those colors as if I'm a tree in the fall time changing from green to yellow. I'm not that same person that he found, but that same God that found me then is still the same God even to this day. And he remains the same, and I remain still dependent on him for life. And so as the trees, as the grass, and as the plants yearn for more life and are dependent on this pond for water, may we as believers and as followers of Christ also become dependent on God, just as plants are and trees are and the grasses that surround this pond for water. May we be dependent on the water, the true living water that can only be found in this life, that is in God, in Jesus Christ himself. May we find true life and satisfaction, and may we always be constantly dependent on God, the pond.